So, hi painters, glad to be with you. Today we're going to be doing a series of tips. I've painted and taught long enough to know that it's so easy to go by the basics and forget to mention them. Things that become automatic we forget to talk about. And so the attempt today is to try to make sure we don't miss some of those important things, starting with the basics. And I've accumulated over 100 of these tips that really help make paintings better. They deal with maybe three categories of issue. One is the tools and techniques and some tips in that realm. And then tips in terms of a composition and creating or conceiving of a painting. And then finally bringing a painting to life and tips to make that happen. And so there are lots of little things along the way, too many to remember, 100 certainly all at one time. But they become ingrained in you, and maybe if we go through them one at a time, they'll be helpful to some of you. The first thing I want to talk about is getting a piece of paper and matting it. I'm using, I'll re-mention, 300-pound watercolor paper, and it has essentially two paintable sides. Fortunately, many a time I've painted on both sides of the paper when something hasn't gone well initially. But there is a slightly smoother and a slightly rougher side to most of these watercolor papers. But 300 pound as opposed to 140 pound. And the reason is 300 pound lays still and doesn't buckle and puddle. 140 pound paper will, on some occasions, do that, making it difficult to achieve the fine-tuned finesse that you're after. But let's get the paper painted. I tape to the backing board. I use museum backing board, which is waterproof, and it is a plastic thing you can buy in Grossman's and other places, versions of it anyway. And it really serves well because water doesn't get into it. And I'm taping my 8x10 piece of paper onto this plastic backing board. How to do that is what I'm going to demonstrate. But before that even, I've long ago resorted to about 4 different sizes of painting, standard sizes, relating to standard frames. It would be unfortunate to have a painting that's a little bit too small, that you have to hunt forever for the exact right size of frame and mat. And you want to avoid that. And it would also be unfortunate if a painting you did was slightly off from the standard size mat so that it showed a white piece where you didn't want it, etc., or an important part of your painting disappeared behind the mat. None of those are things that you want to do, so you need to pre-plan. This is the way I do it. Because 300-pound paper is relatively expensive, I'm going to mention again that 300-pound paper, even though it's expensive, is one of the places you want to spend the money. And the other place is getting fairly decent paints. The brushes, even though good brushes are a wonder, do not matter as much as both the paper and the paint. And so we have good paper, place to start. And I've cut this 8x10 piece of paper slightly larger, not excessively larger, so I have to be careful. So I want to make sure the mat that the painting that I do is bigger than the opening of the mat. So the first thing I do is square it up to the paper. It's always useful to have it relatively square. It would be a funny thing to be painting this at an angle, and for the entire time that would be disturbing your psyche, and you would be thinking less well of the painting. So being neat and orderly from the beginning is something I try to do. Square it up to the paper, and taping just a small portion of one edge of the paper down so it's held firmly. That's like 1/8 of an inch overlap. I turn, this guy's very turnable, stretch out a piece of tape, not excessively long, but about the right length, and do a second edge about 1/8 of an inch again, overlapping. And you notice that I run my thumbnail down so we really get a good seal for water. And then run my finger along the edges of those tapes. Turning it again, but before doing that we need to make sure that the opening and the painting we do is larger than the opening. This is the way I achieve that. I mark it another 1/8 of an inch in, and I put a pencil line in a corner that's already taped, the taped corner. I mark it again 1/8 of an inch in. So we have 2 marks so far, and we add a third. Not way down here because it may not work, but 1/8 of an inch in. With 3 marks, I then take my mat. The mat has a beveled edge if it's a good mat, and I turn the beveled edge upside down so that I'm working from the back of the mat. Any marks I get on it will be not showing. And I drop the mat so that each of those 3 marks show up inside, and I line it up carefully, all 3 marks. When that's done, I remark the corner. I'm doing this lightly, and I'm trying not to touch the lead to the mat. Otherwise it's difficult to erase, and you probably have to throw the mat away. So we ended up with 4 corners marked. Now if I didn't mark it totally, I'm going back to do that. It is there, okay. 4 corners marked. That allows me to set the mat aside, to know where the back side is, put my name on it, and set it aside. And so once we have the 3 pencil marks, 1/8 of an inch inside, then we turn the mat upside down, bevel facing the paper, and drop the mat over so that each of the 3 pencil marks will show. And then we proceed to mark lightly without touching the mat with the lead of the pencil, so we don't have to try to clean the mat, which is difficult to do. We have 4 corner marks. The next thing to do is to drop in the additional 2 pieces of tape. Again, at least 1/8 of an inch and maybe something closer to 1/4 of an inch outside of those marks, so that the painting we're going to be doing will be larger than the opening in the mat and give us some flexibility. And again, 1/8 of an inch or more outside of the mat. Rub your finger, adhere it all the way down, all the way around. So we end up with a firm seal so water won't get under the tape. Set the tape aside, set the mat aside away from any paint because it'll inevitably find paint, and begin to erase the 4 corners. They've been done lightly, so that shouldn't be hard, but I use a kneaded eraser and lightly lift from the tape in to remove those lines from the tape in. So we end up with a clean piece of paper without marks on it that is slightly larger, something like 1/4 to 1/2 inch larger than the opening. And we can drop the mat over it and have it slide around for some slight amount of adjustment and not have the tape show as it does there. There's plenty of room for that opportunity. So that's what I do. There are different ways and systems putting paper, taping it down, but that's the one I found that works pretty well for me.